Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Crystal Eddins, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh. She holds a dual major PhD in African American and African Studies and Sociology from Michigan State University. Her areas of research and teaching include the African Diaspora, social movements and revolutions, race and ethnicity, women and gender, and Atlantic world slavery. Her book, Rituals, Runaways, and the Haitian Revolution, is an interdisciplinary case study that explores the relationship between ritual life, collective consciousness, and marronnage before the Haitian Revolution. Eddins has published other research articles in the Journal of Haitian Studies, Gender and History, the Journal of World Systems Research, and Research in Social Movements, Conflicts, and Change. She is currently developing a second project tentatively titled Black Queens of the Atlantic World, Exploring Enslaved Women's Power, Reproduction, and Resistance in 18th-century British and French Caribbean colonies. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, we both got African American and African Studies degrees from Michigan State University. But we didn't necessarily get a chance to talk about these things while there. So I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about your journey. So let's start with how you got into Black studies as a field.
Sure. So my interest in introduction to Black studies started at Michigan State as an undergraduate. I became a part of the Black Student Alliance like junior, senior year. And around that same time, I started taking classes in the history department with people like Perodak Bovey and Dinah Ramey Berry when she was there, and just several other folks that really just helped me. A lot of those classes on linguistics and culture and Black history, diasporic history really exposed me to not only understand, I think, myself better in terms of being an African American woman whose family comes from the South. So thinking about like the Great Migration and histories of slavery. And so I think those things helped me to better understand myself, my family, community, but also increasingly how Black folks and our experiences collectively have shaped like the modern world more broadly. So thinking diasporically and internationally also was an interesting part of that early experience. So at that time, I actually was majoring in advertising, but increasingly just kind of fell out of, kind of became disenchanted with that and just was not feeling challenged or interested in it anymore. And was just more interested in my social sciences classes. And like I said, I took the minor or a specialization in African American history and culture. And I completed my bachelor's degree in 2006, and then continued to take classes as a lifelong education student. One of the classes I took was like Marxist philosophy in the Africana world with the philosopher John McClendon. So that was also really transformative. I was involved with the African Atlantic research team directed by Walleen Dodson. That was really formative for those early years as I began thinking about entering graduate school and thinking about what the PhD means and what it would mean for me to be able to kind of actualize some of the areas of interest that I had had. I was always interested in studying slavery and studying like resistance and gender and like Black radical politics. And was able to do some of those things, kind of actualize some of those things in the Black Student Alliance space, but wanted to kind of further explore those ideas intellectually and historically. And so, being able to continue to explore those ideas and to explore my interests at Michigan State was a way to do that.
And I guess this will probably interact a little bit with the book that's already out. But what keeps you committed to doing this work? And I'm personally interested in how you came to that specific project on the Haitian Revolution and the role of ritual in that.
Yeah, so I think what overall keeps me committed to Black studies is just the world around us and just a commitment to Black people, Black communities, our past, our future, our survival, our um, life ways, and just the ways that the changing world around us continues to shape and be shaped by the who we are, right? Um, and wanting to continue to um, participate in or contribute to the kinds of struggles that we're a part of and organizing, whether that's environmental justice, reproductive justice, increasingly kind of calls against big data and AI, in the way that that's impacting Black communities. So those are some of the things that kind of broadly keep me committed to Black studies as a whole. How I got interested in Haitian Revolution studies. Again, going back to those late undergrad, early grad school years, I was interested in Black radical politics. I had grown up in a very religious household, very religious community, so was also very interested in like what role religion did or didn't play in Black mobilizations. Um, and Also, I was interested in gender, and so I was taking, like I said, I took a class. I took classes as a lifelong education student, and one of the other classes that I took was on Caribbean spirituality, and it was during that class that I was introduced to the Haitian Revolution and the Bois Cayman ceremony, which was the ceremony, the sacred gathering of rebels and conspirators in Haiti's northern plain in the late 18th century, folks who were gathering in the woods for these religious expressions, but also were conspiring and plotting the revolt that would take place a week later in August of 1791. And so the Bois Cayman ceremony kind of is only one example of several other revolts across the Americas where we see kind of a similar coming together of sacred practice and spiritual life with the resistance and organized revolt or conspiracies to revolt. Because in many cases, those sacred spaces, those opportunities for enslaved people to gather, whether at night and in the woods or on Sundays at burial sites. These were the only some of the only times where they had opportunity to freely converse and to freely commune with one another. And whether that looked like, whether that communing and conversing expressed itself as within the realm of culture, um, within the realm of, again, spirituality, engaging with the Orisha, engaging with the Loa, engaging with ancestral spirits, um, and then using some of those tools to then embody and empower themselves to um, begin to organize revolt. That became, one of the main things that kind of drew me into the Haitian Revolution. Um, and at the same time, there was a woman, Cecile Fatiman, who is described as having led this ceremony along with Boukman Dutty, who was one of the main leaders of the early days of the revolt. So the Bois Cayman ceremony kind of represented this really powerful convergence of all of my interests in Black radicalism, organizing, spirituality, women, and gender.
So, building on that, I know you have your degree is a dual PhD, so you have a focus in Black studies specifically. You also have a focus in sociology. Um, and coming from the same program, like I know how our degrees were structured, and we took a lot of our methods courses in another discipline or our core Black studies courses, and then we were taking courses in our cognitive discipline. But how do you situate yourself now in relationship to both Black studies and sociology? And I would imagine there's a great deal of historical research that you're also
Mhm.
doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So these days, I guess I refer to myself as a Black Studies historical sociologist, since my intellectual grounding and political commitment is primarily to Black studies, um, and and so that's kind of where I begin, and where my work kind of continues to try to engage and make contributions to, regardless of what my departmental affiliation might be as far as my employment. My grounding is in Black studies, and then as it relates to sociology, um, one of the areas that I became really interested in as far as being able to connect history with sociology was the field of historical sociology. Um, Going back to folks like Marx or Durkheim or even W.E.B. Du Bois, thinking about someone like him as being both a historian and someone who is now increasingly being recognized as an early American sociologist in terms of some of the research he did in Philadelphia and at the Atlanta School. And so, um, for me, I feel that some of the strongest sociology is historical, right? Because the concepts and theories that we use to understand what's going on in the world around us, to understand the structures of power, to understand human agency, all of those things are historically contingent, right? They depend on our understanding of like how we got there. And I feel that history gives us the tools to do that. Um, so, again, going back, some of my earliest um, entryway points into Black studies were through the discipline of history, and I really like history, and I didn't want to give that up, right? At the same time, when I started taking sociology and working with the sociologist, and began to understand how to think conceptually and how to think through theory, that also became kind of enthralling in its own way or enlightening in its own way. And I didn't really want to give that up either. And so I think for me, bridging the two just made a lot of sense. And I also kind of lean on folks maybe like a Sinclair Drake. He talks in the beginning of Black Folks Here and There about the importance of kind of bringing together history, sociology, and anthropology as a modality for Black studies. Again, kind of thinking about structures of power, how they come into being, how things change over time, and then what are the things that human beings are doing? Um, what are the ways that humans are living their lives? The formations that emerge from that, and then how can we try to understand the ways that those human formations um, are both influenced by and then shape the broader world and the broader society. So I'm always trying to kind of navigate. I think that the interdisciplinarity of bringing together these fields helps me to try to navigate those kind of macro and micro questions at the same time.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think I because I have a lot of historically based conversations now with my sister, I'm always interested in how people approach um, Black studies using historical tools and methods, because I do know that the archives can be limited in terms of the actual voices of Black people. And I think that especially in writing a book on something as impactful and important as the Haitian Revolution, being able to pull those things out and excavate the humanity and the people themselves, I think is such a powerful contribution to the field. So
Thank
thank
you.
you for that. Um, so how does your work as a teacher, how is that informed by Black studies? And I personally always like to ask, like, what does the Black studies classroom look like, and how might that be different than a more traditional sociology or even history classroom?
Sure, yeah. So my classes generally focus on people of African descent, since that's where we're at. That's what I'm doing. And I try to make that very clear so that they have the opportunity to, opt in or opt out. So, for example, in the fall, I'm getting ready to teach a course on revolutionary social movements. And, typically in that area of research and teaching on revolutions, um, most people will focus on like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, etc. And I touch on some of those things, but how does it relate to the Black world in particular? So maybe what was the Black experience during the American Revolution? Or maybe let's decenter the French Revolution and kind of focus on the Haitian Revolution. And what does that tell us about these Enlightenment ideals and other ideals that maybe don't emerge from Europe, right? What was the kind of African perspective on what it means to be free and equal? Um, so that class in particular kind of focuses on like Black cases of Black revolutions, and revolutions that were specifically countering slavery and countering colonialism and countering capitalism. So last year I had a segment looking at radical Reconstruction as like a kind of somewhat of a revolutionary moment, and the 1898 Wilmington Massacre as like a counter-revolution, like a white supremacist counter-revolution to that. We later looked at the Russian Revolution in the Black world. So what did like Black communist organizing in the early 20th century look like? And what was the revolutionary potentiality of that? We looked at the Cuban Revolution. In past times that I've taught that class, we looked at the 1971 Attica Revolt, the Grenada Revolution of 1979. So really just kind of bringing the perspective to the African and Caribbean and African American worlds, and thinking about like what revolutions mean in that context. What are the historical and racial structures that folks are fighting against, and what are the transformations that they're fighting for? So that's one aspect of it. And then another aspect of how Black studies kind of informs and shapes my teaching is around issues of community engagement. So, when we think about like the origins of Black studies being really created by a protest tradition, and then in those early days being a field that was also intentionally seeking to develop ideas and concepts that could help to further transform Black communities. That's something that I still try to, take seriously and implement when I can. At my previous institution, I taught a course on environmental justice, and students. I had the opportunity to connect students with Black-led environmental justice organizations in the broader Charlotte, North Carolina region. And next fall or next spring, I'll be teaching a class on reproductive justice. So kind of using a similar model where, we'll be kind of grounding the ideas around reproductive justice within the histories of like Black women's experiences under slavery, under Jim Crow, and contemporarily, what that fight for bodily autonomy looks like today, and again, how it's informed by the past. And there's a local organization here in the Pittsburgh region. They work out of Pennsylvania and Eastern Ohio, that is that a Black women and queer-led organization that's focused on reproductive justice. And so my hope and plan is to engage with them and to have students be able to kind of learn some of the theory and history in the class, but then put some of those things into practice in tandem with and in support of the organization. So those kinds of kind of practical applications, if you will, or contributing to the work of communities that theory and praxis is something that is also very important to me, and one that I try to implement and create space for as much as I can.
Thank you. That is a great reminder, right? Talking about the origins of Black studies is coming from protests, particularly student protests, and then making sure to have that connection to community, I think, is always something that is helpful to bring back up in academic spaces, because it can be easy for that to get lost, and it can be easy for us to be in the silo of the academy and not necessarily engage with the community around us. And that's such an important aspect of what Black studies actually is and what it comes from. So, and speaking about that, the past of Black studies, what is it that interests you most about the past of the field in both critical and excited senses?
Sure. So one of the things that I would say that I'm interested in this moment is thinking about how we can draw and establish new genealogies of Black studies, or maybe not new genealogies of Black studies, but just track down some of these varying lineages, if you will. So I'm drafting a paper right now on the Haitian Revolution as a kind of precursor, or as an intellectual precursor of the field of Black studies, because of the ways in which it created the space for discourse and dialogue and struggle against slavery, against colonialism, but also in support of and in propagating this idea of like of alternate ideas of humanity, of shifting that discourse in the 18th and 19th century to um, provide a space where Black people could and would be human, right, in their own sense of self-definition. And I think that question of, you know, altering what it means to be human outside of the kind of Western conceptions is, an important part of what Black studies does. And so for me, I've been kind of thinking with and trying to grapple with what it means for the Haitian Revolution to be kind of one of the earliest articulations of that. Um, and I've seen that in other works as well, where we where scholars are kind of drawing on this kind of radical past, of radical Black liberation struggles to inform our study today. Aisha Finch, for example, has a really great article that I really like on Black feminism and how Black women's struggle um, over time kind of informs and helps to maybe give and shed light on different ways of thinking about what it means to be Black feminist, um, both in a liberatory and in an intellectual sense. So those are the kinds of things that I guess excite me about the past of Black studies. Um, And, as you kind of mentioned earlier in the intro, as far as like, again, kind of bringing some of those voices around Black women in particular into not just into, you know, not just to create a new like framework for Black studies, but in terms of shifting and broadening the epistemology of Black studies, I think is also really important. And so I'm excited about, doing work with, and around this idea of reproductive justice and bodily autonomy, and um, trying to kind of use that as another way to think about, again, what does it mean, not only what does it mean to be a human, but what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to be a Black woman in a particular context, coming out of this modern project. I think that we have a lot that we can maybe learn from the past to help to broaden and shift some of the discourse today.
I agree. I think that there's a lot to be learned from the past. And the point that you made about acknowledging what people in different time periods were aware of, right? Like it makes sense that when Black studies was formulating as a field before it was institutionalized, but when we look at some of the people that we consider to be founders of the field, like they were well aware of the Haitian Revolution. That's something that they would have studied. And so to not explicitly acknowledge that contextually in terms of what was informing their thinking is a missed opportunity. So thinking about a more expansive and inclusive view of the development of the field, I think is super interesting. And right now, it provides a lot of opportunities for considering the strategies of the past and the ability to draw on things that are not the common things we think about today, right? We have a very narrow scope of what is typically included in particularly larger conversations about what constitutes Black studies, but also like what's informing Black radical thought and Black liberation. But going back further, I think is super important. So that's really interesting to me. What interests you and excites you about the future of the field? Or even, so two other things. One, right, in thinking about your upcoming project, what drew you to that, to focusing explicitly on Black women in the Atlantic world? And then maybe what are the questions that as a field we should be asking or exploring moving forward?
Sure. Yeah. So again, kind of going back to those MSU days, I was always interested in finding the women in these radical movements, and maybe when I think about it, maybe it was a way of trying to kind of locate myself um, within some of these histories, or within like my own kind of political formation as far as my own thought. But whenever I would do my, research papers for my classes, I would always focus on women, like um, Black women in the American Revolution. I think I did a paper on women's experiences with sexual assault in prisons. When I took a class with the late Ame Ellis, I wrote a paper on like Black women in the Black Panther Party. So every time I had the opportunity, I would always try to focus my interest on women and gender. And then when I started my dissertation project as a graduate student, though, my initial interest was on women in the Haitian Revolution, was to try to find out, what were women doing? How were they kind of contributing to the revolutionary movement? And who were they, right? But that last question of who were they was not necessarily as easy to answer. So, as I started kind of getting familiar with the historiography and the literature on the Haitian Revolution and women and slavery in the Caribbean, there was just this gap there as far as um, the women participants in the Haitian Revolution and just in slave revolt in general. There are a few women who are named. I mentioned Cecile Fatiman. There are other women who have been kind of described in some of the primary sources, like Sanité Belair, who had been married to one of the officers in the revolutionary military, and other kind of wives or partners of these male leaders, like Suzanne Louverture and Marie-Jeanne Lamartinière and Claire Heroux. So these were women who were there and they were present and doing things, but we don't necessarily get their full stories because they're kind of only mentioned as an appendage to their husband, who was the one making history, so to speak, or quote unquote. And so I kind of decided to shift my dissertation research interests to focus more on the Maroons. Number one, because I felt it would allow me to kind of trace a longer legacy of Black and African resistance leading up to the Haitian Revolution, in order to kind of decentralize France in that conversation, but also because looking at the Maroons and some of the archival material, especially the runaway advertisements from the colonial newspapers, there were just more women present and more women named. Now, women were not necessarily escaping at the same rate as men, but again, the materials that were there, I think, were kind of helped to begin to tell us a story. And so, as I started trying to figure out, like, okay, well, what can I do with some of these materials to kind of explicate a female perspective, or some kind of perspective that gives us an entryway to better understand enslaved women in colonial Haiti. Um, Again, was exploring the archive, the newspapers, and I'd also found a roster of the Manuel Maroon community, who were located in the south central mountains, the Naibe Mountains, which are kind of right along the border, or at least where the border used to be between Haiti and Santo Domingo, present day Dominican Republic. And in this treaty that they had be negotiated with the French, and there's also a Spanish version of this as well, but in the French version, there were about 133 people mentioned by name, and by age, and they're kind of organized by household. And so, in looking at that and seeing how many children that were described in this document, I was somewhat taken aback, because one of the kind of common tropes or common narratives about slavery in Haiti and in other kind of 18th century sugar producing islands was that the conditions were so harsh and so deadly that reproduction was low, that the death rates outpaced the birth rates, and that enslaved women were just not having babies because of the level of like violence and illness and etc. And so I kind of dug into that more, and once I saw other other plantation studies that had calculated this child to woman ratio, which is just the very kind of basic calculation of the ratio between children and women on in one document described, whether that's a plantation document or this Maroon treaty. When I compared the two, the child to woman ratios from these plantation studies, and then the child to woman ratio that I calculated from the Maroon treaty, the Maroon community had a child to woman ratio that was twice as high as almost any that I had seen from these plantation studies, kind of looking at sugar plantations, coffee plantations, indigo, etc. And so I was really kind of struck by that and wanted to kind of better understand, okay, so what does that mean? Right? Because again, another kind of common narrative that we see in literature around enslaved women, especially in the Caribbean, as it relates to how they resisted, is oftentimes we oftentimes hear the infanticide as that primary modality, or using kind of herbal medicinal practices to prevent pregnancy or to end pregnancies. And I believe that happened, and there are several cases in Haiti where women were being accused of infanticide, or accused of creating abortifacients to prevent pregnancies. But here it appeared that having children was a part of or associated with this kind of broader resistance strategy of marronnage. And so I wanted to kind of think through, like, what did it mean for an enslaved woman to, like, maybe want to have a child, or what would it have meant for a woman who finds herself in a maroon space, away from the plantations, perhaps not necessarily in still ideal conditions, right? Because slavery is still there. The broader environment is still very much shaped by racial subordination and violence and death. But in this one particular space, Is there safety? Is there kind of liberation from sexual assault? Is there sexual autonomy? Were women finding that in these kinds of spaces? And if so, how would that have kind of connected to their choices around family formation? And so doing that work kind of led me to the concept of reproductive justice, being the idea of women's right to choose to have children or to not have children, and to raise children in sustainable communities. Um, so working on that paper, which became an article, "Rejoice, Your Wombs Will Not Beget Slaves," really became kind of the turning point for me to begin to kind of continue to think about these questions around birthing and family, not birthing, sexual assault, pregnancy, and how all of these issues, family, marriage, how all of these issues within enslaved and marooned women's intimate lives played a significant role in their ability or their choices or their the constraints to whether or not they were resisting in terms of the I guess the traditional or maybe masculinist way that we think of what resistance look like, right? Marronnage or participating in this broader revolt. Um, but I'm also really interested in kind of perhaps debunking the idea that those were inherently masculinist in some ways. I'm also really interested in how these histories of enslaved women and um, their intimate lives may also destabilize what we know of as gender, or kind of helps to kind of break down or forces us to rethink what it means to be a man or woman in this context, especially one in which sexual violence, for example, was so rife and
Mhm.
common. Um, and also, on the other hand, thinking about like, well, what was the purpose of the sexual violence, right? What did that serve for the plantocracy, um, and how did it perhaps have an effect not only on its most immediate victims in terms of enslaved women, but the broader enslaved community. Um, Men were victims of sexual assault and rape at the hands of slave owners as well. Right? That's kind of a under maybe an understudied, but like a very real aspect of what was happening within these plantation communities. And so I've been kind of looking back to Angela Davis's article on the role of the slave women, or the role of the women in slave communities, where she talks about rape as a tool of counterinsurgency, right? As a not just as a tool to forcefully um, forcefully propagate enslaved communities through forced
Mhm.
reproduction. That's certainly one thing, but we can also think of it as a tool of violence, as a tool of warfare, right? And we still see this in the world today. Um, and so the kinds of psychological terror, the shame, the humiliation, the all of the things that sexual assault and that rape does. Right? I think Davis's piece kind of helps us to think through um, how rape was used as a tool to try to undermine resistance, and to undermine collectiveness,
Mhm.
to create divides between men and women, and to sow seeds of distrust, and on top of the um, to do all of those things on top of the kind of material and just violent sense of um, perpetrating these acts just because they could, right? Just
Mhm.
in order to maintain like the existing power dynamics. So that was kind of around the world. So, but I hope it came back together.
No, it did. And I think that, one, I'm just very interested in the ways in which um, people, in particular Black women in Black studies, are shifting the center of the research that's happening, and looking at enslaved women's resistance strategies and taking them seriously just because they weren't the ones that have traditionally been talked about, or the ones that maybe were as um, considered to be as grand in scale, like running away permanently, or um, being the face of a revolutionary act. Um, there were a lot of women who were doing smaller, everyday acts of resistance, or larger acts of resistance that are not being talked about in the same ways. And I think it's something that is really important to highlight, and to have that be present in these conversations, um, which once again goes back to thinking about the context within which these things are happening, and all of these things leading up to the context within which we are now, and how we can look at these things not just as lessons in the current moment, but to also rethink what we believe to know or have known about the past. So I think that that is, you answered the question, but it's also really interesting to me personally. And it, like, yeah, I have this is the conversation that me and Jess have like every week. So is there anything else you would like to add before I let you get back our last few remaining weeks of summer?
I don't think so. It's been a real pleasure talking with you and catching up, and I'm glad you invited me on to chat.
Well, thank you so much for coming. It's always great to talk to someone else who came through Michigan State, a fellow Spartan. So I definitely enjoyed having you today. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your summer.
You too. Thank you so much.
Thanks.